55 million because of Roe v. Wade. Those people would now be having children of their own. So we probably lost 70 to 80 million Americans that could be part of our economy, producing a product, producing wages, discovering and inventing the next great technology. In Texas, and I've said this often of late, we have to create an environment in this state where people can live with freedom and dignity and prosperity, regardless of what happens outside the boundaries of our state. This must be the place where you can come and know you can build a family and you can have freedom and build a business and not be subjected to the tyranny of federal government. I would support such an amendment. Joanne, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sure the exact language we could discuss and it could be refined, but person starts at conception.
Thank you so much.
Joanne, I too believe that personhood begins at conception, and as Barry mentioned, he was there in the gallery, and he and Mary Jane were in the gallery when we were taking the tough votes. I was not in the gallery, I was on the floor. And so I've been in the arena, not just for the 20-month limit that we passed, and also returning strong protections for ambulatory centers, and making sure that if we're going to have these procedures in Texas, that they be done so that our ladies, our women, our girls are safe, that they're held safe in this state. I also was in the arena for the sonogram bill. And so for the last several sessions, and for in fact my whole time in the legislature, I've been a strong champion of pro-life issues. And so this is something that, as your Attorney General, I will be very strong in defending and making sure that we defend these rights as a state. We protect the Constitution of Texas and the rights of Texans to make these sorts of decisions in our state. Irregardless of what the federal government is moving, or perhaps what other states are saying. It is important to me that we defend Texans' rights to decide upon their own Constitution. And that's something that, as the Attorney General of the state of Texas, I will take very seriously.
Thank you. Okay, Representative Branch, please identify a founding principle of this nation and describe why it is relevant today.
Well, there's so many. The notion that's so important in Texas, of course, here is limited government. And I think we are a beacon of, among the states of limited government. We send our representatives to Austin every 2 years. We treat them as citizens. They're not permanent employees like many states or like the federal government. And then they return home and live under the laws that we've passed. And we pay them even $600 a month. And my wife thinks that's not quite enough. But so to me, I'd say, Joanne, that this notion of limited government, that ultimately personal responsibility and self-government starts at home and in the family and in the community. But it's very important that we expand human creativity through human freedom, human innovation through human freedom. And I think what the founders, if you read the Federalist Papers, you read Madison, you read Jefferson and Adams, these are men that I was inspired by when I first went to Washington to study political economy and sit at the feet of people like Barry Goldwater, as a Barry Goldwater scholar. That these are the issues that inspired me and made me a Reagan conservative. And I've spent my life pursuing these sorts of issues because this is what makes America unique. And I fear this is now what may make Texas unique. That many of our states, and right now this administration, seems to have lost its way on the notion that the states created the federal government. And that the national government has a certain role, but that the state governments have a role. And that the people within those states have certain rights reserved to them. And so I think our federal government has forgotten about the 9th and 10th Amendment. And it's high time we remind them. As your Attorney General, I will be reminding them often.
Thank you, Joanne. The founding principle of our government is that our rights come from God. They do not come from man. Man wrote them down in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, inspired by God, because we recognize, and the Founding Fathers recognized, that man may not be able to constrain himself, that governments inevitably become too big, and they become corrupt, and they attempt to take from man the rights that God has given to him and her. Second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. We're endowed by certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sums up our rights, and they are then memorialized in the Bill of Rights, so that no future leader can take them from us. Our founders recognized that throughout eternity, throughout the life of civilization, that governments would inevitably attempt to take rights away from men. And so they put these words down to govern us so that we knew what the limitations of a federal government would be. The Second Amendment makes it very clear, our right to bear arms. I don't know why it's not the first, because it's really the foundation of all of them. And yet this administration, time after time, tries to take away our right to keep and bear arms. As your Attorney General, this will be one of my highest priorities, to make sure that Texans can keep and bear arms, and when they are licensed to do so, carry them on their person, in their vehicle, in their home. We want people to know that in the Lone Star State, our people are prepared.
Thank you. Commissioner Smitherman, how have you personally reduced the size and scope of state government in your capacity?
Thank you, Joanne. As chairman of the Public Utility Commission, I arrived there in 2004. We had a staff of about 250 people, and when I left 7.5 years later, we had about 175. So we dramatically reduced the FTE count as a percentage, and while we did that, we also increased our customer service, the competitiveness of the market, and we saw electricity rates come down to their lowest level in 10 years. At the Railroad Commission, in my personal office, I'm holding my budget flat. And in fact, we spent less money last year than we were allocated. My other two colleagues on the Railroad Commission opted for a 10% increase in their personal budgets. But you have to lead by example when you're at the top of the food chain. And this is what I've tried to do in my personal life, at the PUC, as well as at the Railroad Commission. The Attorney General's office is a $500 million a year budget. 4,200 people work there in 96 offices. And while General Abbott has some big shoes to fill, of course, one of my first jobs would be to come in, and I want to make sure I know what everybody's doing. I want to make sure that we are spending that $500 million in the right way. Is there a way to save taxpayer money? Are we doing the right thing with the right people and the right tools? It's the biggest law firm in the state. It requires, as its leader, a person who has run a state agency effectively. And I have done that. I have a proven record of saving money, returning money to the state, and bringing down the number of employees working in the agencies where I have held the leadership position.
Welcome, Senator. All right. So the question was, where have I personally given it again?
Yes. Particularly you, Representative Branch, because of being in the legislature and being in the House, where we know a lot of the spending or the cutting that actually goes on. How have you personally reduced the size and scope of state government or championed that since you've been in office?
It's a very important question. Let me start by saying, as I talked about self-governance and limited government, I think it always starts at home. So in my office, in the House of Representatives, I've turned back money every time, every biennium. So that would be point one. of course, when you're elected to the legislature, you have a responsibility that's broader that encompasses the whole state. And so in 2006, I participated in the largest property tax reduction in the history of Texas, a $7 billion reduction. Clap if you want to, that's fair enough. I would say that this Republican majority, I came in 2003, and our Republican majority has kept spending flat. We have not raised taxes. We have stayed within the growth. Of course, as you know, the budget grows because our state has been growing, one of the fastest growing states in America. And so for me, keeping the spending down, not raising taxes, lowering taxes this session, over $1 billion in taxes, and reduced taxes on business, making permanent the small business exemption for businesses. And then I would say also, Joanne, that it's important not just to keep the spending in check, but also make sure that our state continues to thrive. So it's really important that we keep spending and taxes down, but we also invest in infrastructure so that we continue to grow, so we continue to attract the 1,200 people a day who are coming here. But whenever we have parts of government that we don't need, then we ought to get rid of them. And this year, in just a few weeks, you'll have a chance to get rid of a state agency that I put on the ballot, passed constitutional amendment, Proposition 2, to eliminate an unnecessary agency of government. That's how you reduce government in Texas.
Thank you so much. Senator Paxton, since you've spent quite a bit of time in the Texas House and now in the Senate, how have you personally reduced or championed reduction of the size and scope of state government? I think we could hear you before.
No.
How about now?
No.
All right. Well, you
Okay.
couldn't pick a better issue for me. First of all, I'm sorry for being late. My transportation is a little bit of a problem today, but I'm very glad to be in Tyler, where my college roommate lives, and where my good friend Matt Schaefer, who's endorsed me, also lives, and I appreciate being here. I'm glad to be here today to talk about that issue in particular. My first session, I had the opportunity to file an amendment to the appropriations bill that eliminated an agency that had existed for years, the Human Rights Commission. That agency no longer exists as a result of an amendment I put on the appropriations bill. But I've also championed population plus inflation. Had a bill several sessions where I've tried to get state government to limit its spending to population growth plus inflation. In my opinion, government for years has overspent. And I wanted to keep our spending in line with what happens in the economy and what happens with your budgets. I mean, you have to control your spending, and I wanted government to control its spending. And so I filed that bill several times. Unfortunately, it's been very difficult to get through our House, and we've never been able to get it through there, but I consider it one of the most important issues of our time. And I'm convinced if we pass that, part of what we wanted to do with the excess money is return that money to the taxpayers in the form of property tax relief. We were convinced that over a period of years, we could reduce your school property taxes to nearly zero. Can you imagine having zero school property taxes? Basically, you'd be paying only the city and county government and maybe hospital tax. So cut over 50% of your taxes. That is something that I've championed since the day I got there, and something I believe would be great for Texas. And it would also attract more businesses and jobs in Texas. So I don't know if there's a more important bill that needs to be passed in the House and the Senate, and I'm hoping at some point we have leadership in both houses that can do that.
Thank you so much. Sharon, I'm going to go ahead and select a person. Now that we have three, all three here, who will go next, and then now here's where we need you to keep us on track. We're mixing it up so that we don't have somebody go first every time, or last every time. Okay, Commissioner Smith, if you were the Attorney General today, please describe what you would be doing about an investigation into two things. One, the alleged payola program through the University of Texas Law School Foundation, where millions of dollars in forgivable loans were paid out to professors and others with no accountability or transparency? And two, what would you be doing to investigate the claims that big donors and politicians are getting unqualified kids into UT Austin, taking up seats and pushing the truly qualified to other schools or out of state?
Joanne, thank you for that. As Republicans, as conservatives, we must always advocate truth, transparency, and a fair playing ground. Let the Democrats be the ones that try to twist the rules. Let them be the ones who try to shoehorn unqualified kids into a school. Republicans are about integrity and honesty, so I would definitely launch an investigation into this. As a proud graduate of the University of Texas School of Law, I can tell you that it's hard to get in. But when you're in there, you're proud to be part of a great law school. And if anyone uses undue influence to get a kid into UT Law School, or any school for that matter, that's wrong. Kids work their tails off to get into the right school. They study all the time. I'm glad I'm not trying to get in now, because I watch my 4 children studying, and that's all they do. But they do that based on the expectation that the best will get in, that the playing field is level, that it's fair, and it is not because of cronyism or donor influence or any other activity that's wrong. It's hard enough to get into A&M and UT and all of our top schools today. The 10% rule, the 8% rule makes it very challenging. But those kids that do qualify, they should have the spots, not kids because of their last name or the influence of their parents or any other untoward activity gets a spot that a qualified kid doesn't get.
Thank you. Sharon, would you select your next?
Since I've been in the legislature, another one of my big issues has been transparency. My first session, I worked with several legislators to pass legislation that put all government contracts up to a certain level on the internet. And I worked with Comptroller Susan Combs to do that, and previous comptrollers to do that. In almost every session, I'd file legislation that would create more transparency in state government and local government. In my opinion, there's very few issues that are more important than citizens being able to see how our government is operating at the local level and at the state level. In this case, if there has been special treatment for legislators, it needs to be disclosed, it needs to be investigated, it needs to be discovered. And I know, as the commissioner just mentioned, it's difficult to get into law school. I applied to UT, I applied to some of the top law schools in the country, and I was grateful when I got that letter of acceptance. And it is unfair for members of the legislature or for anybody in any kind of elected class to have an advantage in getting people into the University of Texas or any other university. So I would favor full disclosure, full transparency, and disclosure of anything that's happened in relation to the University of Texas or any other school as it relates to special favors or any kind of special treatment for legislators or their friends.
Absolutely, Joanne. The issue here is transparency, openness, accountability. That's something that's been a hallmark for me since I came in, whether it was my very first term, working for more training for the Open Meetings Act or the Public Information Act, or later to make sure that we couldn't have secret votes in the legislature, and pushing through a constitutional amendment in 2007 so that all Texans would know how their representatives and senators vote on any bill that finally passed that affected millions of people. So for me, the issue of transparency, in fact, just this session working with General Abbott, we have moved transparency into the cyber age, if you will, so that we can have local and regional and state governments being able to talk online, but do it in a way that everyone sees the questions that are being asked and how they discuss. So this whole notion of transparency is moving forward as the technology evolves, and we've got to make sure government moves with it. But there should be no, of course, no special favors. And we asked, I was a part of the group that asked that the regions bring in the Attorney General to investigate this situation and make sure he got a full, his group had done it once, and we asked him to come back and take a second look at what was going on. We were a little concerned about paying outside consultants over and over. There was some of that inefficiency going on at the region level, but we're very happy that we've now got General Abbott, who's got a very strong record of being tough and looking at the facts and following the investigation wherever it goes. And so he's now on board, and if I were the Attorney General, I would continue that process of a history of being open, transparent, and accountable, because that's what we have to, in order for citizens, in our system, where the citizen is sovereign, you can't hold us accountable unless there's transparency.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a private property rights question. How's that? Okay, Sharon, you will choose. Who goes next? Representative Branch. Current case law held by the Texas Supreme Court in the City of University Park versus Benners, 1972. The court ruled property owners do not acquire a constitutionally protected vested right in property uses. What is your view of this ruling?
We passed an eminent domain bill, as you know, Joanne, and this has been an issue since I've come in, when we had the Supreme Court ruling in Connecticut that really shook the foundations of eminent domain and the idea of private property rights. And we had a whole movement arise in this state that said, hey, if the government has a legitimate purpose, and this ought to be a very high hurdle, like a roadway that everyone has agreed on is absolutely necessary, like we're now widening along I-35. Well, that's when the government uses its power of condemnation or eminent domain, and there's must be reasonable consideration in that taking. That is a high power of government. That is invading personal property rights. And so for me, this is an issue where, as your Attorney General, I would stand up and make sure that we protected the individual, the citizens of the state of Texas, and make sure that there was a legitimate reason. You're not just going to go in there and take it because you might do something later, or you're not going to go in there and take property in order to give it to some private developer. The only reason our government of, by, and for the people has a right to consider a condemnation is if it is a legitimate purpose for the public good. Otherwise, there ought to be no takings, and there ought to be strong and high respect for property rights. And that's something that this state holds extremely dear, along with our other First, Second, Third, Fourth Amendment rights that have been intruded on by this federal government. So I take this issue very seriously and would do so as the next Attorney General.
Yes, this has been a critical issue in the last 10 years, going back to Supreme Court rulings. And we've passed legislation, I've worked on legislation that would limit the takings to a public purpose. But I'll tell you a little story. I've actually been involved in lawsuits in my practice dealing with this issue. My own city I live in, McKinney, took property from a private developer under the guise of public purpose, and they were going to transfer it to another developer because they liked that use better from the other developer. Now, they argued that it was for a public purpose, that they were going to do it for a parking lot. There are all kinds of excuses made. And despite the fact that I represent the city of McKinney, I actually was part of a lawsuit against my own city because I was disgusted by the fact that they were taking property from a developer that had every right to develop that property. And so, over the course of several years, we were successful in that lawsuit, and we were able to properly and appropriately pay this developer not what the city wanted to pay, but what the value of the property was worth. And we were successful in taking care of property usage. This is a huge issue because the founders of our country came here, and one of the fundamental parts of our government, our Constitution, is private property rights. And if we lose that, under any guise of government taking it for any other reason, we lose the foundations of why we were founded and why this country was established. So this is a great question and critical to continue vigilance for freedom and for property rights.
Well, private property rights are sacrosanct in America. This is what distinguishes us from the rest of the world, where the sovereign or the crown or the corrupt government owns the property rights. It's one of the reasons why we have so much oil and gas development in Texas in particular, because individuals own the mineral estate and the surface estate. And you can decide as an individual what you want done with your property. It's a great thing we don't have a lot of federal property in the state of Texas, because their mechanisms are so different. I've been pleased to be involved in this issue for a long time. The case that Dan was referring to that came out of Connecticut, then Senator Kyle Janik and I worked together when I was chairman of the PUC on drafting that legislation to prevent a government from seizing your property under the guise of economic development. That's a door that we do not want to open. I've also been very proud at the Railroad Commission to differ with my colleagues on the commission about when an oil and gas operator can take hydrocarbon from underneath the property of a landowner that does not want to lease. Now, I don't understand why they don't want to. I would think you'd want to get a revenue stream from leasing, but if you don't want to, that ought to be your right. And so I have dissented from several cases of late where the operator wanted to run the wellbore underneath the lot of an individual who did not want to lease. But I was outvoted 2-1. It ought to be your choice. We may disagree with it, but you, the landowner, ought to have the right to decide.
Hey, Sharon, who will go next? Okay, I try to be really careful with questions, not to lead the witness. Well, I'm getting pretty close to doing some crosses here, I have to tell you guys. Define activist attorney general, and if elected, would you be one?
You know, it's interesting. I've been in the legislature for 11 years, both the House and the Senate, and I've noticed some real changes for Texas, and I've noticed some real changes in the legislature. And you might be surprised, you might not be surprised, but my first 5 or 6 years, we focused on state issues. Imagine that, state issues for Texas. But over the last, however long Obama's been in office, that's changed. And we now struggle with the federal government constantly intruding into the state of Texas. And so, fortunately, we had an attorney general who recognized that issue. We had a legislature that's recognized that issue. And Texas has been a leader in this country in fighting back. Yes, God bless Texas. And we need to continue that fight. The Attorney General, if I'm the Attorney General, when I'm the Attorney General, I guarantee you we will be fighting the Obama administration on voter ID, on redistricting, on marriage, on the pro-life issue, on Obamacare. I'm telling you, the EPA, the list goes on and on. And it's not important just for Texas. It's important for this whole country that Texas lead. Because if we don't lead, I don't think anybody else will. And we have the opportunity as Texans, not only to be a great state, but we have the opportunity to lead this country against an oppressive federal government. We have the opportunity really of a lifetime, much like our founders, to make a difference for our state and for our entire country.
Well, I'm proud that I'm the only one sitting at the table that's actually sued the EPA. I've done it 5 times, working with General Abbott. 7 times, working with General Abbott. And we do it not because we like litigation. As conservatives, we like to see people sort things out. We don't like trial lawyers pursuing unmerited case. But we have to stand up for the Constitution and laws of the state of Texas. And with this EPA, they are bound and determined to shut down the oil and gas industry. Make no doubt about it, we have a crosshair on us. The fact that we're the #1 producing oil and gas state in America, right here in Texas, just makes it all the more likely that they're going to come after us. So we have to continue to fight back. Some may characterize that as activists. I characterize it as looking out for our citizens, as making sure that the pillars of our economy, fossil fuel, coal, pipelines, gas, oil, all of those continue to produce. One of the regulations that the Obama EPA tried to cram down our throats would have shut down coal plants in Texas in 2012. Several of them not too far from here. Had that happened, we would have been unable to keep the lights on here in Texas this summer. I don't know about you, I like air conditioning. I like prosperity. So we sued on this. We've won at every level. And now the Supreme Court has granted certiorari on this case. And it will be heard probably this fall, if not in the spring. We're winning. We're winning because we're not taking it. We're standing up and asserting our rights and suing the Obama EPA, Fish and Wildlife, and any other agency, and we're winning, and we have to keep doing it.
John, let me distinguish between an activist and attorney general, which I will be if I'm privileged to serve as the next attorney general of the great state of Texas. I will be activist. That's different than activist judges who we don't want to have, and we want judges that are careful and interpret the law and don't try to make law, that they understand that the legislature or the lawmaking branch is where law is made. But an attorney general is part of the executive branch, so we want them to be active in enforcing and protecting Texas citizens. So I agree with Senator Paxton that Attorney General Abbott has been an outstanding fighter for Texas. And he has worked, as I would, with many Republican attorney generals across the state to push back against this overreaching federal government. I think the environment now is worse than when General Abbott came in 2002. So I think we need someone that's as tough or tougher as General Abbott. And he's plenty tough. And so for me, yes, I will be an active attorney general. In fact, I'll be pushing back against this IRS and the DOJ and Holder and the NSA and the EPA. Oh my goodness. This IRS is completely out of control. So I'll be pushing that, but I'll also be holding them accountable for not securing our border or not getting our water from Mexico. So when the people, the lawyers that put together the framework, the fight for Greg Abbott and the fight for Senator Cruz when he was solicitor, the people that they had around them, the people that were helping them do the hard work, when they kicked the tires on these 3 candidates because they were looking early, when Andrew Weber or Kent Sullivan or Jim Hogue or Sean Jordan or Becky Gregory or Jonathan Frells or David Skank, when they took a look at the candidacies, I was really pleased that they supported me and my candidacy for Attorney General. I think that says something.
Okay. Representative Branch. The Cancer Research Institute, or the secret scandal, I would like for you to define that. And I would like for you to define how we could have avoided having that spending bring us to a level of having a criminal investigation.
Well, we certainly had an investigation. We've had several investigations, and to me, let's first talk about the issue, make sure everyone knows. The secret is the Cancer Research Institute of Texas. And the concept here was to bring the best minds to Texas to do research on preventing cancer. This was a big initiative of Governor Perry. And so when we put this legislation into place, the initial reaction was very positive in that we were bringing, we had testimony, we were bringing the best minds to MD Anderson and UT Southwestern and here to Tyler and to San Antonio and to Houston. And the idea was, again, a noble cause to try and see if we could make Texas the place in the nation to find a cure for this scourge that has hurt so many of our families. So the issue was, did they enact their process in a way that was proper? And what we found out was that as they built up this agency and got rolling, apparently some corners were cut. And so we had the state auditor take a look at it, and the Attorney General was actually sitting on this board, and now we have come back this session and took the findings of the state auditor. The ox was in the ditch, it was kind of muddy, and we've tried to pull the ox out of the ditch and clean it off and put in even more accountability and more protections for taxpayer dollars and see if we can get this thing back on the straight and narrow. The notion was a valid notion, but the execution turned out to be flawed. And as we know that often when humans are involved, you often can have pilot errors. So it's my hope that we will now see, with the new accountability and the new tough rules and regulations, that this will now be something that's an asset for Texas and not something that's a burden on taxpayers.
I actually disagree that it was a valid notion. I was one of the few legislators that voted no on this particular bill. In my opinion, government should not be, thank you. That was not a good bill. In my opinion, I am a conservative, and in my opinion, government should not be taking $3 billion from you and figuring out some charitable cause for it. That should be your job. It's your job, not the government's job. And even worse than that is that we borrowed the money. We borrowed $3 billion to put money into research. So we didn't even have the money. We borrowed it, we paid hundreds of millions of dollars in interest. It is not the core function of government to make those decisions. And I struggle with this because I believe it is a good cause. We want to cure cancer. But we had another state rep who was suffering from MS. What if he'd gotten up and said, what about $1 billion for MS? Well, then do we do research? Do we take your money for MS research? What about heart research? What about prenatal research? What about, I mean, the list goes on and on. Where does the government stop taking your money? It should be your decision as to what causes you want to give to. And I am loath to take money out of your pocket, no matter how noble the cause, if it's not a core function of government. And in my opinion, it was not a core function of government. And look, when you hand the government $3 billion, you don't expect them to mess it up. You don't understand government. We all know that's the truth. We look at Washington and they do the same thing. And that's why I knew this was going to be a problem. And that's why I voted no. And we see the problems that we got. And if we do this again, we'll have the same problems. This was a bad idea from the beginning.
Corruption and waste can never be tolerated, period. It's your money. We take it from you involuntarily, and you expect that we'll use it correctly. 9 years ago, as a private citizen, I challenged then Houston Mayor Lee Brown. Y'all remember him? He was Clinton's drug czar. That as mayor of Houston, he was wasting our money. He was raising too much debt and overspending the money that was coming in. As a private citizen, I challenged him along with Michael Berry and Paul Betancourt. And from that time on, we've been trying to pressure the city of Houston and Harris County to use some of the ideas you've heard, not spend more than the growth in population and the CPI. It is all in the execution. That's why, as your next Attorney General, you need someone who's actually run a large state agency. and done it well, and done it with fewer people, and done it within budget, and gotten the most performance out of those people for your money. Always the difference between a winning football team and a losing team is the execution of the plays. Do you have a coach that knows how to win? Do you have a coach that knows how to get the most out of his players? It may have been a good idea to do this, but the execution was wildly flawed. And when you think about the Attorney General's office with a $500 million a year budget, you better put somebody in there that knows how to execute. Somebody who knows how to run a big agency. That's me, and that's why I want to be your next Attorney General.
Okay, so Senator Paxton is going to go next. Okay. Now, because there are times in the history of Texas where someone who runs for Attorney General and the people reward that individual for running and they actually hire them for the job, sometimes they want to trade up, maybe be lieutenant governor or governor in the future. So just suppose that, and that's why I'm asking you this question. On funding for the Emerging Technology Fund, the Texas Enterprise Fund, and the Special Events Fund that funds things like Formula One racing. I want you to look out there and into the camera there for the people who are all across the state that are watching this. Tell them what your position is on that and sell them on your position.
Government's best functions are as basic as they can be. Education, transportation, water, as simple as it can be. I've struggled with this issue because I know that money's going to be spent on other things. And so it's a challenge to figure out if that money is going to be spent on other things than core functions in a budget. Because when we get the opportunity to vote on a budget, we don't get to, as a vote, we get the whole budget. And so you have to decide what's the best budget we're going to get out of 181 legislators. In my opinion, it's been a flawed move to go towards funding any of this stuff. I would much rather have the population plus inflation and return the money to the taxpayers in the form of property tax relief and other tax relief. Spend our money on core functions, spend it on the things that you expect us to, and then stop the spending, cut taxes, make it easier for you to continue to own your homes. One of my biggest frustrations, having been in office for 11 years, is that the property tax has been cut very little. We cut it, then it goes back up. And the reality is, you're a renter. You don't own your home. Right. The second that you don't pay your taxes, the government takes your home. You should not be a renter. This kind of money ought to be returned to the taxpayer in the form of property tax relief. And you ought to, at some point in your life, you ought to be able to own your property, your home, free of government interference, free of the government being able to take it from you because you didn't pay your taxes. There ought to be some time in your life that you own that property. So I would love it if we could move away from this stuff and we could focus on the core function of the government. We could limit spending to population plus inflation and return the rest of the money to the taxpayers.